Chapter 1. Dust and Desperation. The sun hung low in the cloudless sky, its searing rays baking the parched earth beneath it. The land stretched in all directions, cracked and dry, the once fertile fields now a desolate shade of brown. A gust of wind kicked up a swirl of dust, sending it dancing across the ground before settling over the warped wooden planks of the farmhouse porch. The place had seen better days. Before the drought, before the debts, before her father had passed and left Lily McCrae to carry the weight of their crumbling legacy on her own. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her gaze sweeping over the remnants of what had once been a thriving homestead. The barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof sagging like an old mare's back. The corral fence was missing entire sections where the wood had been used for firewood last winter. Even the front porch, where her mother used to sit and shell peas in the evenings, had boards so loose she had to step carefully or risk tumbling through. Her fingers curled around the railing as she stared out at the endless horizon, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. How much longer could she hold on? The answer came with a sickening certainty. Not long. The bank had already sent its final warning, a week, maybe 2, before they came to claim what her family had worked generations to build. The thought burned hotter than the noonday sun. "Lily, you going to stand out here brooding all afternoon, or you going to come take a drink?" She turned at the familiar voice to find old Jim Langley standing by the well, his face creased with the wear of 60 hard years. His broad-brimmed hat was pushed back, revealing silver-threaded hair, and his suspenders hung loose over his work-worn shirt. Jim had been a friend of her father's for as long as she could remember, and when the bad times had come, he'd stuck around like a burr in a horse's tail. "I'm thinking," Lily said, forcing a small smile. Jim snorted, drawing up a bucket of water with slow, deliberate movements. "Thinking too much'll get you nowhere, girl. You ought to rest a minute." "I'm fine." But she wasn't, not really. The creak of a wagon drew her attention toward the road leading to the homestead. A single-rig carriage approached, kicking up a thin veil of dust behind it. She recognized the driver before the wheels even came to a full stop. Mabel Carter climbed down, adjusting the bonnet that barely contained her greying hair. She was round and sturdy, with the kind of no-nonsense air that made people sit up straighter in her presence. In her younger years, she'd been a midwife, but these days she spent most of her time tending to folks who needed a helping hand. Mabel strode up the porch steps with her usual briskness, eyeing Lily the way a mother hen would a wayward chick. "You're thinner than last time I saw you," she said, hands on her hips. Lily chuckled, though the sound held little humour. "Maybe you shrank." Mabel arched a brow. "Smart mouth. Won't put food on your table, Lily girl." "I know." She lowered herself onto the porch step, resting her forearms on her knees. "I know, Mabel." The older woman's features softened, and she sat beside her with a sigh. "Word's getting around town about the bank. People are worried about you." Lily stiffened. "Why, nothing to worry about," Jem scoffed. "That's so? And what's your plan then? Going to work yourself into an early grave trying to fix what's past fixin'?" Lily lifted her chin, but the fight in her chest felt hollow. "What else am I supposed to do? This land, it's all I got left of my folks." Mabel reached over, giving her hand a squeeze. "Maybe it's time to think about options you ain't considered before." Options? Lily knew what she meant. There had been whispers in town, suggestions that she find a husband, someone who could shoulder the burden with her. But she wasn't ready for that, wasn't ready to tie herself to a man for the sake of survival. Still, the bank didn't care about her pride, and no amount of hard work could make rain fall from the sky or crops sprout from dead soil. Mabel sighed. "You ain't got to decide right this minute. But, honey, you don't got to do this alone." Jim nodded. "Ain't no shame in asking for help." "No shame at all." Lily swallowed past the lump in her throat. She wanted to argue, to tell them she could handle it, but when she looked out over the land, her family's blood and sweat turned to dust, she wondered how much longer she could pretend. A storm was coming, even if the sky remained clear, and unless she found a way to fight back, She'd be swept under like everything else the frontier had swallowed whole. The sound of approaching hooves sent a chill down Lily's spine. The rhythm was steady, purposeful, the kind of approach that signaled official business. She didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. From her place on the porch, she tightened her grip on the rough wood of the railing, watching the horizon where the land stretched barren and dry. The air smelled of sun-baked dirt, brittle grass, and something else. Something heavy, like the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She didn't move when the rider came into view. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't rushing to deliver the news that would shatter what little hope she had left. The man sat tall in the saddle, his well-fitted coat and stiff-brimmed hat telling her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. A banker's man. Jim, who had been working at the well, straightened and wiped his brow. His keen old eyes met hers, and she saw the worry in them, the quiet understanding that this wasn't a visit that would bring anything but trouble. The rider brought his horse to a stop in front of the porch, dismounting with a practised ease. He wasn't old, but there was a coldness to him, a sharpness in his eyes that made Lily's stomach knot. A man who had seen too many farmers break beneath the weight of unpaid debts and never spared them a second thought. He took a slow step forward and tipped his hat, his expression neutral. "Miss McCready," Lily forced herself to stand, smoothing her hands over the apron tied around her waist. "That's me. My name's Garrett Hanley. I represent the First Territorial Bank out of Denver. You likely know why I'm here." The wind caught the edges of her skirts, lifting them slightly, but she stood firm, her chin raised. "I reckon I do." Hanley sighed as if he'd rather be anywhere else. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges crisp, the ink undoubtedly neat and impersonal. "Your last payment was due 3 months ago. We gave you a reasonable extension, but you're well past that now. The bank's been patient, Miss McCready, but patients don't keep accounts balanced." Lily's throat burned as she stared at the paper. That single sheet of parchment, stamped and sealed with authority, had the power to take away everything her father had worked for, everything she'd struggled to hold on to. She swallowed hard, refusing to let the man see her fear. "I just need a little more time." Hanley's expression didn't waver. "I'm afraid time's run out." He extended the notice toward her. "You've got 14 days to vacate the property. If you don't, the bank will be forced to take possession." 14 days! The words crashed over her like a cold wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. 2 weeks to gather up what little she had, to find some place to go to, what, move to town and take on washing to make ends meet? Sell her mamma's few remaining belongings just to put food in her belly? Jim took a step closer, his hands fisting at his sides. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rough. "She's got nowhere to go." Hanley turned slightly, his posture polite but unmoved. "I don't make the rules. I just deliver the news." Lily could feel the weight of Jim's fury, the way he tensed beside her, as if he were ready to take a swing at the banker's man. She reached out, touching his arm, a silent plea for him to let it be. This fight wasn't one that could be won with fists. She forced her gaze back to Hanley and lifted her chin. 14 days, she repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "That's right." He tipped his hat again. "I am sorry, Miss McCready, I truly am." But he wasn't. Lily knew a man who carried regret in his bones, and Hanley wasn't one of them. He was just another cog in a machine that didn't give a damn about the people it crushed beneath its wheels. He didn't linger. He swung back into the saddle, gave a final nod, and turned his horse back toward the trail. Within moments, the dust swallowed him, and the sound of his departure faded into the empty silence of the ark. Lily's hands trembled as she stared at the paper in her grip. She could barely see the words, but she didn't have to. She already knew what it said. 14 days to watch her world crumble. Jim exhaled sharply beside her. "We'll figure something out, girl. You ain't alone in this." She wanted to believe that, but as she looked out over the land, the dry, unforgiving soil, the wind-worn buildings, the years of sacrifice written in every splintered board and every cracked window, She felt a fear so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. Her father had fought for this land. Her mother had bled for it. And now she was supposed to just walk away? Her pride screamed at her to do something, to find a way to hold on. But what choices did she have left? Her hands curled into fists around the eviction notice, her breath coming in slow, measured pulls. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't. But Lord help her, she didn't know how she was going to fight this battle alone. The sun dipped low behind the jagged hills, casting long shadows across the barren land. The sky was a canvas of fire, streaked with oranges and reds, so rich they almost looked painted. A soft wind stirred the dry grass, rustling through the brittle stalks like a whisper of things long gone. Lily stood on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the last of the daylight bleed into twilight. The land before her stretched out wide and empty, as if it too had given up hope. Once this soil had been fertile, had yielded golden wheat and sweet corn, had kept a family fed and a future secure. Now it was nothing more than dust and broken promises. The eviction notice lay on the porch railing, catching the final rays of light before the evening dimmed. It was just a piece of paper, flimsy and small, but it might as well have been a death sentence. 14 days. 2 weeks to pack up a lifetime, to walk away from the only home she'd ever known. Her throat burned. It wasn't fair. She clenched her jaw, pressing her hands against the rough wood of the railing. The last thing she would do was cry. Crying never fixed anything. Behind her the house groaned softly as the night settled in, the wood stretching and shifting like a weary old man. It was a sound she had known since childhood, a sound of safety. No matter how hard the world had been, at the end of each day she had always come home to this place. And now? She wouldn't let this happen. She couldn't let it happen. Maybe the bank thought she was just some helpless farm girl with no options, no fight left in her. Maybe they figured she'd roll over, let them take everything her parents had built without a struggle. They were wrong. Lily Macready wasn't one to lay down and accept defeat. She'd worked this land with her bare hands, sweated through endless summers, faced lean winters with her chin up and her heart steady. She had fought to survive, and she wasn't about to stop now. The bank wanted her gone. Let them try. The only way they'd take this land was if they dragged her off it, kicking and screaming. The last sliver of sun disappeared, and the sky deepened into shades of indigo. The first stars flickered into sight, tiny pinpricks of light against the vast dark. A promise. That was what her father had called them when she was little. Every night the stars come back, Lily girl. Even when the world goes dark, they shine. You remember that? You remember, no matter what happens, you keep shining too. She swallowed hard. I promise, Papa, she whispered, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. I won't give up. I won't let them take what's ours. Somehow, some way, she'd find a way to keep this land, even if it meant making a choice she never thought she'd make. As the cool night air settled around her, the weight of that vow pressed deep into her bones. Whatever it took, however she had to do it, she would fight. And she had no idea that decision would lead her straight into the arms of the one man who could change everything. The town of Silver Rock lay bathed in the golden glow of dusk, the long shadows of storefronts stretching across the dusty street. The scent of baking bread and roasting meat drifted from the boarding house, mingling with the sharper tang of horses and pipe smoke. A warm breeze stirred the dust, sending it swirling in lazy spirals before it settled again, coating everything in a thin film of grit. Sheriff Cole Maddox walked the length of the boardwalk, his boots striking a steady rhythm against the weathered planks. His broad shoulders cast a long shadow, his well-worn duster shifting slightly as he moved. Though his posture was easy, his gaze remained sharp, scanning the streets with the vigilance of a man who had seen too much of the world to let his guard down. The town had a quiet to it this evening, but Cole knew better than to trust peace in a place like this. The frontier was a lawless thing, wild as the untamed land that stretched beyond the town limits. It had a way of breeding trouble, of turning good men desperate and bad men worse. He adjusted his hat against the dipping sun, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the badge pinned to his vest. Law. Order. Justice. Once he'd believed in those things with the fervour of a preacher at Sunday service, believed that a man could stand between the wicked and the innocent and make a difference. But time had worn that belief down like water over stone. The faces of the men he'd put in the ground haunted him still, some deserving, some not. The weight of those choices sat heavy on his soul, a burden he'd long since stopped trying to ease. A flash of memory hit him, swift and sharp, blood on his hand. A man gasping his last breath at his feet. A woman screaming. Cole exhaled sharply and shoved the thought away. The past was the past, and he'd long since learned there was no outrunning it. He kept walking, nodding in passing to the few folks who acknowledged him. A group of ranch hands loitered near the mercantiles, swapping stories and laughter over bottles of cheap whiskey. Across the street, a woman swept dust from the steps of her boarding house, pausing only to cast a wary glance his way before ducking inside. He supposed he couldn't blame her. A lawman made folks uneasy, especially one with his reputation. Some said he was ruthless, some said he was fair. Most just knew better than to cross him. And he preferred it that way. A sudden crash shattered the quiet. Cole's head snapped toward the commotion. Across the way, outside the general store, two men grappled in the dirt, fists flying. A crowd had already begun to gather, voices rising in excitement. With a sigh, Cole descended from the boardwalk and strode toward the brawl. "Break it up!" The command cut through the din, but the men were too deep in their scuffle to heed the warning. One threw a wild punch, the other tackled him to the ground, both landing in the dust with a grunt. Cole didn't bother shouting again. He reached down, grabbed the scruff of the nearest man's collar and yanked him backward with ease. The second man, a wiry fellow with a busted lip, scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. "That's enough," Cole said, his tone calm but edged with authority. The man he still held twisted in his grip. "He stole my damn horse!" The other man wiped his bleeding mouth with the back of his hand. "Liar!" Cole leveled them both with a hard stare. "You want to keep swinging? Fine by me. But you can do it from the inside of a jail cell." That got their attention. The first man scowled but stopped struggling. The second wiped his hands on his pants, suddenly looking less inclined to fight. "Now," Cole continued, loosening his grip but not releasing his hold entirely, "somebody want to tell me the truth?" A murmur rippled through the gathered onlookers, and then a woman stepped forward, Mrs. Pritchard, the shopkeeper's wife. "I saw it," she said. "The sorrel gelding outside the saloon, that one belongs to Jed here." She nodded toward the man in Cole's grasp. "Other fella was trying to ride off with it." Cole looked between the two men. Jed nodded vigorously. The other man opened his mouth to protest, but at Cole's warning look he clamped it shut. "Sounds like you were about to steal another man's property," Cole said evenly. "That about right?" The accused man bristled but dropped his gaze. "All right then." Cole jerked his chin toward the jailhouse. "Let's take a walk." With a firm grip on the man's collar, Cole hauled him toward the small sheriff's office, ignoring the murmurs from the crowd as it began to disperse. By the time he locked the thief inside a cell, dusk had fully settled, casting long shadows through the barred windows. Cole leaned against the desk, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Another night, another scuffle. The job never changed, but as he turned toward the doorway, something in the street caught his eye. A messenger boy, shifting from foot to foot, his face pale and uncertain. "Sheriff Maddox?" Cole straightened. "Yeah?" The boy swallowed hard and stepped inside, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "Miss McCready sent me, she needs help." Cole took the paper, his gaze flicking over the hurried words. Then he let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Where is she?" The boy hesitated. "At her farm, sir. She don't have much time." Cole's jaw tightened. He didn't know Lily Macready well, but he knew her kind, the ones who fought tooth and nail to survive in a world that didn't make it easy. And if she was sending for him, she was in deeper trouble than she could handle alone. Cole Maddox turned the note over in his calloused hands, scanning the scrawled words once more. "Miss Macready needs help. Urgent. Nothing else, no details." No explanation, just those 4 words, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. His gut twisted. He didn't know much about Lily Macready, only what he'd overheard in town over the years. She was stubborn, proud, and had been fighting tooth and nail to keep her family's land ever since her father passed. Now it seemed that battle had come to a head. Cole exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb along the paper's edge. "What kind of trouble is she in?" he asked, his voice even. The boy swallowed. "Dunno, sir, just said it was real urgent, sent me all the way here as soon as she could." Cole nodded, slipping the note into the pocket of his vest. "All right, you did good, kid. Go on now, get yourself something to eat." He fished a coin from his pocket and tossed it to the boy, who caught it with wide eyes before darting off into the dusk. Cole was about to step outside when a familiar voice stopped him. "That letter's got you thinking, don't it?" He turned to find Everett Granger leaning against the doorframe of the jailhouse, arms crossed over his chest. The older man was well-dressed, clean-shaven, silver hair neatly combed, his vest buttoned over a crisp white shirt that marked him as a man who'd never worked a day of hard labor in his life. But what he lacked in calluses he made up for in influence. Everett owned half the businesses in Silver Rock and had a say in the rest. Folks came to him when they needed loans or when they wanted favors, whispered into the right ears. Cole had never had much use for men like him, too slick, too calculating, but Everett had never given him a reason to outright distrust him either. Cole narrowed his eyes. "Something on your mind?" Everett studied him for a long moment before stepping inside, closing the door behind him. "I hear you just got word from Lily Macready." Cole tensed. "You hear a lot for a man who stays out of other people's business." Everett chuckled, but there was no real humour in it. "Ain't hard to hear things when folks come knocking on your door. That girl's in a bad way, Maddox. You already know that, though, don't you?" Cole didn't answer. Everett sighed, stepping further into the room. "She's about to lose that land. The bank's got their hands wrapped tight around her throat, and the way I hear it, there ain't much she can do to stop it." Cole leaned back against his desk, arms crossing over his chest. "You got a reason for telling me this?" Everett tilted his head, his sharp gaze flicking over Cole like he was sizing him up. "You're a man who don't stick his neck out unless he's got a damn good reason. I reckon you might find one soon enough." Cole felt a slow burn settle in his gut. He wasn't a fool. Everett never spoke without purpose. The man was warning him, in his own roundabout way, that getting involved with Lily Macready would change something. Cole straightened, his expression unreadable. "And what's your interest in this?" Everett smirked. "Only that Silver Rock ain't got much use for another foreclosure. We let too many folks get swallowed up by the banks. Pretty soon we ain't got a town left at all." He turned toward the door, adjusting his cuffs. "Just thought you ought to know." He stepped outside, pausing only once to glance back over his shoulder. "If you do go out there, Maddox, don't wait too long. She ain't got much time." Then he was gone, his boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk as he disappeared into the twilight. Cole stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind churning. He wasn't the kind of man who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Hell, he had enough trouble of his own. But something about this sat wrong. He could ignore it, pretend he hadn't received the message, but that wasn't who he was. With a sigh he reached for his hat and settled it low over his brow. Looks like he had a ride to make. Chapter 2. A Deal in the Dust. Initial Meeting. The Silver Spur Saloon was a place of whiskey, whispered deals, and hard-earned coin lost in a game of cards. Tonight the air carried the scent of pipe smoke, sweat, and spiced beef stew from the back kitchen. Lamplight flickered against the wooden walls, casting shifting shadows over the men hunched at their tables, their conversations little more than low murmurs beneath the scrape of chairs and the clinking of glasses. Lily Macready hesitated just inside the doorway, her fingers clenched in the folds of her skirt. Her nerves thrummed like a plucked banjo string, but she squared her shoulders and forced herself to step forward. She hadn't wanted to do this. She'd fought against it, told herself she'd find another way. But desperation had a way of scraping a person raw, grinding down pride until survival was all that was left. And she intended to survive. She spotted him instantly. Sheriff Kel Maddox sat at a table near the back, his chair tilted on two legs, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way that didn't fool her one bit. He had the look of a man at ease, but his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Even in the dim lighting there was a watchfulness to him, the kind that came from years of knowing trouble could come from any direction. Lily lifted her chin and strode toward him, the heavy rustle of her skirts swallowed by the saloon's din. If he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. "Miss Macready!" His voice was deep, steady, the kind that settled in a person's chest and stayed there. "You look like a woman with something on her mind." She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need your help." One dark brow lifted. "That's so." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Go on then, sit down, and tell me what kind of trouble you've got yourself into." She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pulling the chair back and lowering herself into it. The wood was worn, smoothed by years of use, and she resisted the urge to wipe her hands on her skirt. Cole set his drink down, his gaze steady on hers. "I already know about the bank." Her stomach clenched, but she kept her expression unreadable. "Then you know why I'm here." He leaned forward slightly, the dim light catching on the hard planes of his face. "I know you're running out of options." Her spine stiffened, heat rising to her cheeks. "I didn't come here to beg." His mouth quirked at the corner. "I didn't say you did." They stared at each other for a moment, the saloon noise fading into the background. The weight of the moment settled between them, thick as the dust outside. Lily exhaled slowly. "I need a way to keep my land." "You're a lawman. You know how to deal with these things." He nodded once, slow and measured. "I do." And what exactly are you asking me to do, Lily?" She swallowed hard. She'd run through the words in her head 100 times, but now that they were here, the weight of what she was about to propose settled heavy in her chest. "I need a husband." He didn't blink. He just regarded her with that quiet, unreadable expression, as if he were sizing her up, measuring her words against whatever thoughts were running through his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Marriage? Huh?" She forced herself to hold his gaze. "The bank won't take my land if I've got a man to run it. A husband would give me the legal standing to hold on to my property. And you came to me." There was something in his voice she couldn't quite place. Not amusement, not surprise, something quieter, something almost dangerous. "You're the sheriff," she said simply. "You've got a reputation for being fair. I need someone I can trust." His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers drumming once against the table. "That all?" She hesitated, just for a moment, but he caught it. His gaze sharpened, and for the first time since she sat down, she felt like he was seeing more than what she was saying. "I don't expect anything else from you," she said carefully. "This is a business arrangement, that's all." He studied her, the saloon's dim lighting casting deep shadows beneath the sharp cut of his cheekbones. "Marriage ain't just business, Lily. It can be." A slow exhale. He sat back, stretching his long legs beneath the table. "And what happens when the bank's satisfied? You just plan to walk away?" She lifted her chin. "If that's what you want." His mouth twitched, like maybe he was amused, but he sobered quickly. "You really willing to do this?" "I don't have much choice." The words were steel-wrapped, but he heard what lay beneath them, the quiet fear, the determination. He rubbed a hand along his jaw, his expression unreadable. "You ever been married before?" "No." "Ever thought about it?" "Not like this." Another silence. Then he said, "You know what folks say." She swallowed. "Let them talk." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "If we do this, Lily, we do it right. I ain't seen in my name to a piece of paper just for show. Marriage means something to me." A flicker of something passed through her, something she didn't dare name. "And what does it mean to you?" she asked. His gaze was steady. "Responsibility, protection, commitment." Her throat tightened. That was more than she'd bargained for, more than she'd thought he would say. But she couldn't afford to back down now. "So we do this," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "We sign the papers, the bank stays off my back, and you get whatever it is you're looking for out of this arrangement." His jaw tensed, and for a long moment she thought he might refuse. But then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "We do this." Relief flooded her so fast her fingers trembled against the table's edge. "But you listen to me, Lily," Cole continued, his voice dropping to something that sent a shiver along her spine. "You marry me, you don't just get a name on a paper, you get a husband." A weight settled in her chest. She wasn't sure what that meant, but something told her she was about to find out. Lily gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white beneath the dim glow of the saloon's oil lamp. The space between her and Cole Maddox felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken tension. "You're certain about this?" Cole's voice was steady, calm. Too calm. Lily swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the piercing blue of his eyes reading into her deeper than she wanted. "I wouldn't be here if I weren't. You say that now," he murmured, leaning back in his chair. His duster shifted as he crossed his arms, the leather creaking with the motion. "But marriage ain't something you just walk into without considering the cost." "I've considered it," she bit out, her patience wearing thin. "I know exactly what this will cost me. My pride, for one." Cole's jaw tensed. "Marriage shouldn't be about pride." A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Well, it sure as hell ain't about love, either." His gaze sharpened. Lily pushed forward, refusing to let her nerves get the best of her. "I have 2 weeks before the bank takes my land. You and I both know that once it's gone, there's no getting it back." "I can't let that happen, Cole." "I won't." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb along the rim of his whiskey glass. "And what do you think this arrangement will look like? You expect me to put my name on a paper, claim you as my wife, and then just let you go about your business?" "If that's what you want," she said softly, but she knew even before the words left her lips that it wasn't what he wanted. His jaw flexed, and he looked away, staring at some distant point beyond the saloon walls, as though measuring the weight of what she was asking. Lily's fingers curled into her lap. "You told me marriage means something to you, that it's about responsibility, commitment." She took a deep breath, pushing aside the rising panic in her chest. "I understand that. But this doesn't have to be complicated, Cole. We both need something out of this. You need legitimacy. A wife will settle your reputation and make folks trust you as more than just the lawman with a gun, and I need protection. From the bank. From the men who would take my land the moment I'm alone." His gaze snapped back to her, sharp and unreadable. Lily met it, refusing to back down. A long silence stretched between them, the sounds of the saloon dimming beneath the weight of the moment. Finally, Cole let out a breath and straightened. "All right." Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. "All right." His lips pressed into a thin line. "We do this, but on my terms." A lump formed in her throat. "And what are those?" "You come with me to town tomorrow," he said. "We go to the judge, we make this legal. None of this temporary talk. No backing out when things get hard." His voice was low, firm. "If we do this, Lily, we do it for real." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Not because she was afraid of him, but because for the first time since stepping into this saloon, the reality of what she was about to do hit her full force. This wasn't just a plan anymore. It was real. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay." Cole watched her for a long moment, as though trying to decide if she truly understood what she was agreeing to. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Lily hesitated, her fingers trembling at her sides. A handshake, that was all this was, a deal sealed like any other transaction between two people, and yet when her palm slid against his, warmth spread up her arm, curling deep in her belly. His grip was strong, firm, the rough calluses on his skin reminding her that he was a man who had seen hard days, had worked, had fought. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then, in a quiet voice, Cole said, "We take care of each other. That's the deal." Lily nodded, her fingers tightening in his. "That's the deal." The wind had picked up by the time they left the saloon, stirring dust along the empty streets. The town had settled into the hush of night, lanterns flickering in the windows of boarding houses and shops, the scent of horse and sagebrush thick in the air. Cole led her across the street to the small two-story inn near the livery, his stride slow and measured. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left the saloon, and she wasn't sure if that unsettled her or not. She was grateful when they reached the door. The innkeeper barely glanced up as Cole set a few coins on the counter. "2 rooms," he said gruffly. Lily felt something tight in her chest loosen. She hadn't known what to expect, hadn't known if he would assume that tonight. But he was giving her space for now. She turned toward the stairs, gripping the rail with cold fingers. She could feel his presence behind her, solid and steady, like a storm cloud she wasn't sure would bring rain or lightning. At her door she hesitated, turning back to find him watching her. "You all right?" His voice was quiet, unreadable. "No," but she nodded anyway. "Yeah." Cole studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow changes everything." She swallowed hard. "I know." He lingered another second, then turned toward his own door, the weight of the night pressing down around them both. Lily stood there long after he disappeared inside, staring at the worn wood of her own door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the knob. Tomorrow she would be a married woman. Tomorrow her life would no longer be her own. She just prayed she hadn't made a mistake. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, casting a gentle glow over the quiet town of Silver Rock. The streets were still, save for a few early risers, shopkeepers setting out their wares, a ranch hand leading a string of horses toward the livery. Outside the small inn, Lily Macready stood beside a saddled mare, the crisp morning air raising goose-flesh along her arms, despite the warmth of her woolen shawl. The finality of what she was about to do settled deep in her chest, pressing against her ribs like a stone. She tightened the strap on her saddlebags, her fingers trembling slightly. This was it. She wasn't just leaving town. She was leaving behind the last scraps of her life as she'd known it. By day's end, she would be a wife in the eyes of the law, and before long she'd either be a woman who had saved her land or lost everything. The sound of bootsteps behind her made her turn. Cole Maris approached, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen too much to be in a hurry. He carried himself like he was always prepared for a fight, and maybe he was. His dark duster billowed slightly in the morning breeze, and his hat was pulled low, shielding sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "You ready?" he asked, his voice as steady as the ground beneath them. Lily swallowed hard and nodded. "As I'll ever be." Cole didn't press her for more. He simply adjusted the rifle strap to his saddle, mounted his horse with the ease of a man who'd been born in the saddle, and gave her a nod. "Let's ride." She climbed up onto her mare, settling into the leather. The familiar stretch of the saddle beneath her eased some of her nerves, and she clicked her tongue, guiding the horse forward. They rode out of town without a word, the sound of hooves kicking up dirt the only thing filling the silence. Lily kept her eyes ahead, but she couldn't help but glance sideways at Cole every now and then. He rode like a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on solid ground, relaxed but always alert, one hand resting lightly on the reins, the other near the revolver at his hip. She knew little about him beyond what Silver Rock's gossips whispered. An ex-ranger, a man with a reputation for swift justice, a loner who didn't take kindly to liars or fools. But that wasn't the whole of him. She could tell just by looking at him, a man who had lived his life by the law or carried burdens. And Cole Maddox looked like a man with too many. She wanted to ask him about them, but she didn't know if she had the right. So instead she focused on the road ahead. The dry earth stretched far and wide, broken only by the occasional patches of sagebrush and the skeletal remains of a long-dead tree. The sun climbed higher as they rode, its warmth spreading across the land. Eventually Cole broke the silence. "You ever been this far outside of town before?" Lily hesitated, then shook her head. "Not since I was a girl. My father used to take me on trips to sell cattle, but it's been years." Cole nodded like he understood. "It's different out here. Less rules, less people, just land as far as the eye can see." She studied him for a moment. "Is that why you like it?" He glanced at her, one brow raised. "Who says I like it?" She smiled faintly. "You don't strike me as a man who stays anywhere he don't want to be." He gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Fair point." Lily turned her gaze back to the trail, the weight of the conversation settling in. "I used to dream of leaving," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Not forever, just long enough to see something different. I'd hear stories about cities back east, about people with fine clothes and grand houses. I always wondered what it would be like to be one of them, to not have to worry about cattle prices and rain." Cole didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "And now?" she sighed. "Now, I just want to keep my home." Cole was silent for a moment, then said, "Your father built that place from nothing, didn't he?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "He worked himself to the bone for it, my mother too. Every fence post, every wooden plank of that house. It's theirs. It's all I have left of them." Cole glanced at her then, his blue eyes sharp but unreadable. "That why you're doing this?" Her fingers tightened around the reins. "Yes." Cole's gaze lingered on her for a second longer before he turned back to the trail. "That's a good enough reason as any." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry earth and sun-warmed grass. Lily stole another glance at Cole. "You haven't told me why you're doing this," she said. His jaw tensed slightly. "A man like me doesn't get many second chances." She frowned. "What does that mean?" He hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I spent years as a ranger, rode from one town to the next, always chasing someone down, always looking over my shoulder. You do that long enough, it gets real easy to forget where home is. If I don't settle down now, I don't reckon I ever will." Lily stared at him, taken aback by the honesty in his words. Cole looked straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "And if I can do some good while I'm at it, help a woman like you keep what's hers?" He shrugged. "Seems like a fair trade." Lily swallowed past the tightness in her throat. She hadn't expected him to answer truthfully, hadn't expected him to reveal something real beneath all that steel. For the first time since they struck their bargain, she felt the edges of her fear soften. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't in this alone. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. They rode on, the horizon stretching wide before them. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying with it the sharp scent of dry earth and something else, something unsettled. Lily squinted against the rising gust, gripping the reins tighter as her mare snorted and tossed her head. A low growl of wind rumbled across the open plain, kicking up dust in thick, swirling tendrils. The sky, once a brilliant stretch of blue, had turned a sickly, yellow-tinged grey. Cole reined his horse in beside her, his jaw tight as he scanned the horizon. Storm's coming. Lily didn't need him to tell her that. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air had gone dry and electric all at once. He pointed toward a dark shape in the distance, a sagging barn with a leaning roof and half-collapsed walls. "We need to get there, now!" She nodded, nudging her mare forward, but the wind was rising fast, whipping at her skirts, sending her hat tumbling. Dust clawed at her throat, filling her lungs with grit, and she had to fight not to cough as the storm howled around them. By the time they reached the barn, the wind had grown vicious, flinging dirt and debris into the air like a furious beast. Cole swung down from his saddle first, reaching for Lily's reins before she could even think to dismount. "Come on!" he ordered, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the wind. She slid down, and the second her boots hit the ground he caught her wrist, pulling her toward the barn's heavy wooden doors. They groaned as he shoved them open just wide enough to let them and the horses through before slamming them shut against the gale. Inside, the barn was dark and filled with the scent of old hay and wood rot. The wind howled against the walls, rattling the loose boards, but it was quiet compared to the chaos outside. Lily stood there for a moment, chest heaving, dust clinging to her face and clothes. She swiped at her cheek, coughing against the dryness in her throat. Cole turned toward her, his face shadowed in the dim light. His hat was covered in dust, his duster streaked with dirt, but his eyes, those sharp blue eyes, were clear, steady. "You all right?" She nodded, still catching her breath. "You? Seen worse?" He pulled off his hat and raked a hand through his dark hair, shaking out the dust. "Storm should pass soon, we just need to wait it out." Lily glanced around the barn. The walls were sturdy enough, despite their age, and there was an old ladder leading up to a loft where broken crates and rusting tools lay abandoned. She exhaled, exhaustion settling into her limbs now that they were safe. "Well," she murmured, her voice softer now, "at least it's dry." Cole's mouth twitched. "That's one way to look at it." They worked in silence for a while, leading the horses to an empty stall and brushing the dust from their coats. The wind screamed outside, the wooden beams creaking in protest, but inside it felt like time had slowed. When the work was done, Lily sank down onto a pile of hay near the back of the barn. Cole hesitated for a moment before settling down beside her, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while neither of them spoke. Then, softly, Cole said, "I used to get caught in storms like this when I was a kid." Lily turned to him in surprise. His face was unreadable, but there was something distant in his eyes, something that said he wasn't entirely here in this barn, in this moment. "My father had a cattle ranch down in Texas," he continued. "Biggest problem we had wasn't bandits or wolves, it was the weather. A storm like this could take out a whole herd, bury a house in dirt so deep you'd be digging out for days." Lily studied him, taking in the rough edges of him, the way his hands flexed against his thighs, as if bracing for something unseen. "Sounds like a hard way to grow up." He huffed a quiet laugh. "It was, but I learned how to survive. Learned how to read the land, how to keep moving when everything around me said to give up." He glanced at her then, his blue eyes piercing. "Reckon you know something about that." She looked away, staring at the dust swirling in the lamplight. "I suppose I do." A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt ease. Lily took a breath and let herself relax, just a little. "I used to dream about storms," she admitted. "When I was little, I thought if it rained hard enough it would wash away all the bad things, the droughts, the hard years, the loneliness." She swallowed. "But storms don't fix anything, do they?" Cole didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "No, but sometimes they bring change." Lily turned to him again, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt something shift between them, something small but undeniable. Cole wasn't just the lawman she'd made a deal with. He was a man who had seen hardship, a man who knew what it was to fight for something, and maybe, just maybe, he was someone she could trust. Seamless transition. The storm finally began to die down, the wind easing into a soft hum, the dust settling like a heavy blanket over the land. Cole stood first, stretching his arms before offering her a hand. "We should head out before we lose too much daylight." Lily hesitated only for a moment before slipping her fingers into his. His grip was firm, steady, just like everything else about him. As they stepped out into the clearing sky, the air smelled fresh, new, as if the land itself had been given a second chance. She wasn't sure what lay ahead for them, but for the first time since this journey began, She thought maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd feared. Chapter 3. Trials on the Frontier. The road stretched long and empty beneath the midday sun, heat shimmering off the dusty trail ahead. The air was thick, dry, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant river water. Lily had never travelled this far from home, and despite the tension coiled in her belly, she couldn't deny the quiet beauty of the open land. Cole rode beside her, silent as always, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes, his gaze scanning the horizon. He had a way of watching everything without looking like he was paying attention, a wariness she'd come to recognize over the past few days. Lily shifted in her saddle. "You ever get tired of being so quiet?" Cole didn't look at her. "You ever get tired of asking questions?" She huffed. "No." A corner of his mouth twitched, and she felt a strange, unexpected warmth at the sight of it. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him since they started this journey. But before she could press him further, Cole's posture changed. His back stiffened, his head turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Lily instinctively followed his gaze, her pulse kicking up as she spotted movement along the ridge to their right. Shadows against the rocky outcrop, shifting, moving. Too fast to be an animal. Cole muttered a curse under his breath. "We've got company." Lily's breath caught. "Outlaws? Looks like it." He reined his horse in slightly, keeping his movements slow and controlled. "Stay close." She did, her fingers tightening around the reins as her heart hammered against her ribs. A moment later they emerged. 4 men on horseback, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung over their backs and pistols strapped to their hips. Their leader, a tall, wiry man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek, urged his horse forward, stopping just a few feet ahead of them. Cole remained perfectly still, his face impassive. "Afternoon, boys." The scarred man grinned, but it was a cold, empty thing. "Sheriff Maddox, heard you'd be passing through." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "That's so?" The outlaw tipped his head toward Lily. "Who's the lady?" Cole didn't flinch. "My wife." The man's grin widened. "Well, ain't that something? Thought you was a lone wolf, Maddox. Guess even a lawman needs someone to keep his bed warm." Lily's skin went cold, but she forced herself not to react. She wasn't about to give these men the satisfaction of seeing fear. Cole's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You got business here, or you just running your mouth?" The man's smile faded. "Reckon that depends on you, Sheriff. See, you're riding through our land." Cole's grip on his reins didn't change. "Didn't realize the governor deputized you boys to start collecting tolls." The outlaw's expression darkened. "Ain't about tolls, it's about respect. You want to pass through, you leave something behind." His gaze flicked toward Lily, and she felt the weight of it like a stone in her gut. "Reckon we'd settle for the lady's horse." Cole's entire body went still. Not a twitch, not a flicker of movement. Lily felt it then, the shift in the air, the kind that came before lightning struck, and when Cole finally spoke, his voice was low, dangerous. "That's not gonna happen." The scarred outlaw's hand drifted toward his pistol. "You sure about that?" Lily's pulse pounded in her ears. There were 4 of them, and only one Cole. She might not know much about gunfights, but she knew those odds weren't good. Her mind raced. They needed an advantage. Her gaze darted around the trail, scanning the terrain. The outlaws had the high ground, which meant a straight fight would end badly. But there was a narrow ravine just behind them, half hidden by brush, and if they could draw the outlaws in— Lily's hand tightened on the saddle horn. "Cole," she murmured, "the ravine." His eyes flicked toward her just for a second. Then she saw it, the briefest acknowledgement, the silent understanding. He gave her the barest nod. Lily inhaled sharply, then did something reckless. She jerked the reins hard, spinning her mare in a sudden burst of movement. The horse reared, kicking up dust, and for a split second the outlaw's attention snapped to her. That was all the opening Cole needed. In a flash he drew his revolver and fired. The first shot took the outlaw's hat clean off. The second sent one of his men scrambling for cover. Chaos erupted as gunfire cracked through the air. Lily didn't wait. She kicked her horse into a run, heading straight for the ravine. Cole was right behind her, bullets whizzing past as the outlaws scrambled to recover. Dust choked the air, the horse's hooves thundering against the earth. Then, just as she'd hoped, the outlaws took the bait. They followed. She heard their shouts behind her, the pounding of hooves, but the ravine was just ahead now, hidden behind the thick brush. Lily leaned low over her horse's neck, praying she had judged the timing right. Then, just as she reached the edge, she yanked hard on the reins. Her mare skidded to a stop, rearing slightly, and Cole did the same just beside her. The outlaws didn't have time to react. The first two horses barreled straight into the ravine, their riders barely able to pull up in time. The last man swerved violently, his horse slipping on loose rock and sending him tumbling into the dirt. Cole was on him in a second, gun pressed against his temple before he could even reach for his weapon. "Drop it!" Cole ordered. The outlaw hesitated. Cole cocked the hammer. The pistol clattered to the ground. Lily exhaled, her heart slamming against her ribs as the dust settled. Cole's jaw was tight, his face hard as stone. He turned to the remaining men. "You tell your boss that the next time he tries to rob me, he better send someone smarter." The outlaws didn't argue. They scrambled to pull their remaining men from the ravine, throwing Cole dark looks but not daring to challenge him. Cole didn't lower his gun until they were gone. Lily swallowed, still gripping the saddle horn like a lifeline. Cole turned to her then, and for the first time his expression softened, just a little. "You all right?" She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "I think I just lost 10 years of my life." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You did good, Lily." Something warm unfurled in her chest. She hadn't just been a burden. Surely Dave'd helped. Cole holstered his gun, glancing toward the horizon. "Come on, let's get moving before they get any ideas about coming back." Lily nodded. As they rode away from the ravine, the tension in her chest eased just a little. They had faced their first fight together, and somehow she knew it wouldn't be their last. The fire crackled softly in the still night air, its glow casting flickering shadows against the rough bark of the trees that surrounded their small clearing. The world beyond was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl and the gentle rustling of the prairie grass in the breeze. Overhead the sky stretched vast and dark, an endless sea of stars glittering against the inky black. Lily sat on a worn woolen blanket near the fire, her arms wrapped around her bent knees, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She still felt the residual tremors of adrenaline from the standoff earlier that day, but now that they were safe, at least for the moment, she could finally let herself breathe. Across from her, Cole rested with his back against a fallen log, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his hat tipped slightly forward. He looked as he always did, solid, steady, unreadable, but there was a quiet ease in his posture, as if the tension of the day had loosened its grip just a little. Lily poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare and drift into the night. "You think they'll come after us again?" Cole exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw. "Maybe, but they got a good scare today. I reckon they'll think twice before trying anything stupid again." She glanced up at him. "You didn't even hesitate back there." He met her gaze, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Didn't have time to." She let out a soft, breathless laugh. "I barely had time to think, let alone act. I don't know how you stayed so calm." He shrugged one shoulder. "Years of practice." Lily studied him for a moment. "You've done this before, haven't you? Faced down men like that?" His expression darkened slightly, his gaze drifting toward the fire. "Yeah. More times than I'd like to count." She hesitated before asking, "Does it ever get easier?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, his fingers idly brushing against the rim of his hat. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "No. You just get better at living with it." The words settled deep in Lily's chest, heavier than she expected. She turned her gaze back to the fire. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to hide it, but I was—" Cole didn't say anything right away. Then, after a pause, he said, "Fear's not a weakness, Lily. It means you've got something worth fighting for." She swallowed against the lump in her throat. For so long she had carried the weight of this fight alone. She had convinced herself that showing fear, showing anything other than sheer determination, was a kind of failure. But here was Ko, a man who had seen more danger than she could imagine, telling her that fear didn't make her weak, it made her human. She let out a breath and glanced at him again. "You were impressive back there," she admitted. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone move that fast." Ko smirked, tilting his hat back slightly. "Is that your way of saying thank you?" She narrowed her eyes at him. "Maybe." His smirk deepened. "I'll take it." For the first time in days, a genuine laugh bubbled out of her. She shook her head, a small smile still lingering on her lips. "You're impossible, you know that?" He tipped his hat at her. "So I've been told." The air between them shifted then, not tense, not uncertain, but something else. Something lighter. Lily realized with a small start that this was the first time she had truly relaxed in his presence. She leaned back on her elbows, looking up at the stars. "I used to dream about seeing places like this," she murmured, "travelling beyond the farm, beyond the town. I never thought I'd actually do it, though, not like this." Cole turned his gaze toward her. "And what did you imagine it'd be like?" She sighed. "Less dust, fewer gunfights." Cole chuckled, a deep, warm sound that made something inside her chest loosen. "Well, I hate to disappoint you," she smiled, shaking her head. "I guess it ain't all bad." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with a quiet, comforting rhythm. After a while, Cole spoke again, his voice softer than before. "Your father would be proud of you." Lily's breath caught. She turned to look at him, surprised by the quiet sincerity in his gaze. "You don't know that," she whispered. He nodded. "Yeah? I do." She blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. No one had said those words to her in a long, long time. And coming from Cole, a man who barely knew her but had already seen the fight she was putting up, they meant more than she could put into words. She swallowed hard and looked back at the fire. "Thank you." Cole didn't say anything else, but he didn't have to. They sat there for a long time, neither speaking, neither moving, just existing in the quiet, shared space of the night. And for the first time since this journey began, Lily didn't feel quite so alone. The fire burned low, the warmth of the embers casting a soft glow over the clearing. Cole shifted, standing and stretching with a quiet groan. "We should get some rest. We've got a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." Lily nodded, standing as well, brushing off the dust from her skirts. Cole hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he tipped his hat. "Good night, Lily." She felt the corners of her lips lift. "Good night, Cole." As she settled into her bedrobe beneath the wide open sky, she realized something unexpected. Somewhere between the dust storm, the outlaws, and the quiet moments by the fire, she had started to trust him, and that, more than anything else, terrified her. The town of Red Bluff loomed in the distance, the buildings small and clustered, the wooden facades weathered by years of dust and wind. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang through the valley. Lily rode beside Cole, her back straight, her hands tight around the reins. She wasn't sure what she expected when they arrived, but an uneasy weight settled in her stomach. This wasn't like Silver Rock, where folks at least knew her name. Red Bluff was different. She had come here to speak with Mr. Jacobs, the land agent handling her father's disputed deed. It was a necessary step to securing what was rightfully hers, but she hadn't anticipated just how much resistance she'd face. Cole's horse moved in easy strides beside her, but his expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the town as though he expected trouble. And maybe he did. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly as they neared the first row of buildings. Lily inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I don't have much of a choice." He gave a slow nod. "Then let's get this done." They rode into the heart of town, drawing the wary eyes of those who lingered on the boardwalks. Lily could feel the weight of their stares, The assessing, judging kind. She kept her chin lifted, but deep down the scrutiny made her uneasy. Cole dismounted first, his movements fluid and unhurried as he reached for her reins. "Let's stable the horses and find Jacobs." She nodded, sliding from the saddle, her boots kicking up dust as she landed. As they walked toward the office, murmurs followed them. Lily heard her name, hushed but unmistakable. "McCready girl, thought she'd lost that land? Why she got him with her? Reckon she thinks she can change things, walks in here like she owns the place." Lily stiffened, but forced herself to keep walking. Cole remained beside her, his presence solid and unshaken. They reached Jacob's office, a modest building wedged between the mercantile and a tailor's shop. The sign on the door read William Jacobs, land agent. Cole held the door open for her, and she stepped inside. The room was lined with shelves, stacked high with ledgers and papers, dust swirling in the golden afternoon light. Behind the desk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and sharp eyes peered up from a stack of documents. "Miss McCready?" he said, setting his pen down. "I wondered when I'd be seeing you." Lily forced a polite smile. "Mr. Jacobs, I came to discuss my father's land. I believe you have records that prove it's still under my rightful ownership." Jacobs steepled his fingers, regarding her carefully. "Records, yes, but proof?" He exhaled. "That depends on who you ask." Lily's stomach tightened. "I'm asking you." Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his gaze flickering to Cole before settling back on her. "You've stirred up quite a fuss, Miss McCready. A lot of folks have an interest in what happens to that land. You being back in the picture complicates things." Her jaw tightened. "It shouldn't. That land belongs to me." Jacobs sighed, rubbing his temple. "Legally, maybe, but legally don't mean much when folks have been eyeing that property for years, thinking it would end up on the auction block." Lily's fists clenched. "So that's it? You're saying they get what they want because they expected it?" Jacob's expression darkened. "I'm saying you'd best tread carefully. You're walking into a hornet's nest, Lily." Cole, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "We're not here to make trouble, Jacobs. Just want to see the documents." The land agent studied Cole for a long moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then finally he reached for a drawer, pulling out a stack of papers. He slid them across the desk. "This is what I've got, but I warn you, Miss McCready, there are men in this town who won't be happy about you pushing this issue. They see that land as an opportunity. You're an obstacle." Lily picked up the documents, her pulse quickening as she scanned the familiar details of her father's claim. "I'm not an obstacle," she murmured. "I'm the rightful owner." Jacobs exhaled sharply. "Try telling that to the town council." An hour later, Lily found herself standing at the center of a heated town meeting, the low-ceilinged hall packed with men whose faces ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Cole stood beside her, arms crossed, his stance protective but unintrusive. "This land was always meant to be used for cattle," a grizzled rancher barked from the back of the room. "McCready's gone and the bank nearly had it. Now she comes back and expects us to change our plans." "It ain't yours to plan for," Cole said coolly. "That land wasn't yours to take, and it sure as hell wasn't the bank's to sell." Murmurs spread through the crowd, shifting and restless. Another man, this one younger, cleaner cut, dressed in a business suit, stepped forward. "No one's arguing legality, Sheriff," he said smoothly. "But there's a difference between what's legal and what's practical. Miss McCready has no husband, no family, no resources to run that land properly. What happens when she fails? We can't afford to let good land go to waste." Lily lifted her chin. "I haven't failed yet." The man scoffed. "And how exactly do you intend to keep it running? You expect us to believe you'll just manage on your own." "I won't be on my own," she shot back before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air for a long, heavy moment. All eyes turned to Cole. A slow smirk tugged at the businessman's lips. "Ah," he said, "so that's what this is about. You think putting a ring on your finger is going to change anything?" Lily's pulse pounded, but before she could respond, Cole did. "I think it means she has someone to stand beside her," he said flatly, And if you got a problem with that, you can take it up with me." Silence fell over the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in the air was thick, charged. Finally, Jacobs, who had remained silent through most of the meeting, cleared his throat. "Enough," he said. "We've heard both sides. The land belongs to Miss Macready, and she has the right to prove she can keep it, whether we like it or not." The murmurs started again, some resentful, some begrudgingly accepting. Lily let out a slow breath. She had won this round, but she had a feeling the fight was far from over. As they left the meeting hall, the night air cool against her flushed skin, Lily turned to Cole. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He adjusted his hat. "Yeah, I did." She studied him, something warm settling deep in her chest. For the first time since this journey began, she didn't feel like she was standing on shaky ground, and she had a feeling that was because of Cole Maddox. Inner turmoil, Lily's walk at dawn. The morning air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the change of seasons, though summer still clung stubbornly to the land. Lily walked slowly along the edge of town, her boots scuffing the dry earth, her breath visible in the cool dawn light. She had barely slept. The town meeting had drained her, leaving behind a restless energy she couldn't shake. Even now the weight of those men's stares, their skepticism, their resentment, still clung to her like a second skin. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and lifted her gaze toward the horizon. The sky was a soft pink, streaked with gold, the first rays of the sun stretching long fingers across the rolling land. Her land. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. She had fought so hard to hold on to it, but at what cost? The Lily Macready who had grown up on that homestead had never cared for power, for recognition, for proving herself to anyone but the land itself. She had tilled the soil with her own hands, rode out storms with her father at her side, and dreamed of nothing more than the quiet rhythm of home. But the woman she was becoming, she wasn't sure she recognized her. A woman who had to fight in town halls instead of in the fields, a woman who had to barter, negotiate, and stand toe-to-toe with men who doubted her at every turn, a woman who had agreed to a marriage not for love, not for family, but for survival. Would her father even know her now? Would she? Lily swallowed hard, shaking her head as if she could dislodge the doubts pressing in on her. She wanted to believe she was doing the right thing, that keeping the land at all costs was worth it, but there was a whisper in the back of her mind that wouldn't quiet. What if holding on to it means losing yourself? She turned back toward town, exhaling a shaky breath. She didn't have the answer. She only knew that turning back wasn't an option. Cole's brooding night. The sheriff's office was dark save for the glow of an oil lamp on the desk. Cole sat in his chair, boots propped up, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. He hadn't meant to stand up for Lily like that, not in front of the whole town. He'd told himself from the start that this was business, nothing more, that helping her was about doing the right thing, about keeping her safe, about ensuring a woman who had been dealt a raw hand didn't lose everything she had left. But standing there in that meeting, watching those men look at her like she was less, it had burned something hot in his chest, and before he'd even thought twice about it, he'd made it damn clear that she wasn't standing alone. Now, sitting here in the silence, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Not because he regretted backing her up, hell, he didn't, he'd do it again in a heartbeat, but because he knew himself. He'd spent most of his life alone, a drifter, a lawman who didn't put down roots, who didn't let people get too close. He'd told himself he liked it that way, and yet here he was, married, tangled up in land disputes, standing between Lily Macready and the whole damn town if he had to. When had this stopped being just about helping her? When had this started to feel personal? Cole ran a hand down his face and let out a low curse. He didn't know the answer. And that was what scared him most. By the time Lily returned to town, the streets were coming to life. Shopkeepers were sweeping their front steps. The blacksmith had begun his steady hammering, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the boarding-house kitchen. She wasn't ready to face anyone, not yet. but she needed to see Cole. She found him at the sheriff's office, sitting behind his desk, staring at nothing in particular. He looked tired, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his gun belt resting on the chair beside him. For a moment she just watched him. She had spent so much time thinking about what she was losing, her land, her old self, that she hadn't stopped to consider what he might be giving up. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't the kind of man who settled down and took root. And yet here he was. For her. She swallowed, stepping forward. "Did you sleep at all?" Cole looked up, his blue eyes searching hers. "Did you?" She huffed a small, tired laugh and sank into the chair across from him. "No," he smirked faintly. "Then I guess we're even." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. If anything, it felt steady, like the calm after a storm. Lily hesitated, then said softly, "Thank you for standing up for me last night." Cole's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze shifted. "You don't have to thank me for that." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "You didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to put yourself in the middle of this." He studied her for a long moment, then finally he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Lily," he said quietly, "you think you're fighting this battle alone, but you're not." She felt something crack open inside her, something raw and vulnerable. She had spent so long believing she had to do this on her own, that no one else could understand what it meant to fight for something that had been hers since birth. But Cole did. Maybe he had always understood. She let out a slow breath, nodding. "All right." He quirked a brow. "All right?" She managed a small smile. "All right, Sheriff, I won't argue. For now." Cole chuckled, shaking his head. "I suppose that's the best I'm gonna get, huh? For now." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, wasn't tense. It was something new. Something that felt an awful lot like trust. And as they sat there in the quiet of the sheriff's office, neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. Whatever came next, whatever fight, whatever storm, they weren't facing it alone. Chapter 4. Unmasking the Past. The town was quieter than usual, a stillness settling over the dusty streets that made Cole's instincts hum with warning. He had spent years learning to read a town's pulse, the way it breathed, the way it whispered when something wasn't right. Tonight, the air carried a different weight, one that had nothing to do with the cool night breeze and everything to do with the man standing in front of him. Nathan Ellis, a ghost from another life. The saloon lanterns cast long shadows over the boardwalk, flickering against Nathan's lean frame. He was taller than Cole remembered, his once boyish face carved into something sharper, harder. The years had deepened the lines around his mouth, turned his hazel eyes colder. Cole hadn't seen him in almost a decade, and yet there he was, leaning against a wooden post outside the Silver Spur, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Cole exhaled slowly, keeping his stance loose but ready. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Nathan tilted his head, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Figured you wouldn't." Cole studied him, the years of silence between them stretching taut. "You here for a drink, or are you here for me?" Nathan chuckled, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "Guess that depends on whether you still got a conscience." The words landed like a strike to the ribs. Cole felt the familiar weight of old regrets settle in his chest, memories stirring beneath his ribs like restless ghosts. The heat of Texas sun. The smell of gunpowder. The weight of a dying man's body in his arms. The day he walked away from it all. His jaw tightened. "You still holding a grudge after all these years, Alice?" Nathan pushed off the post, stepping forward with slow, deliberate strides. "Depends. You still tell yourself you did the right thing?" Cole didn't flinch, but something sharp twisted inside him. It had been a long time since he'd let himself think about the past. The Texas Rangers, the lawmen who rode into the dust and never quite came back the same, He and Nathan had been young then. Too young to understand the weight of the decisions they made, too stubborn to admit when a fight wasn't worth the blood it cost. And then there had been that day, that one damn day that changed everything. "You walked away," Nathan said, his voice quieter now but no less cutting. "Left the rest of us to deal with the aftermath." Cole's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Wasn't my fight anymore." "Wasn't your fight?" Nathan let out a bitter laugh. "That so? Tell that to the ones who didn't make it out." Guilt slashed through him, sharp and familiar. He had made his choice, had told himself for years that it was the only one he could have lived with, but had he ever truly believed that? Cole took a slow breath. "I didn't leave because I was scared, Ellis. I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore." Nathan's eyes flashed. "And what about the ones who didn't have that choice? The ones who stayed?" Cole met his gaze head on. "And what did staying get you?" Silence. Nathan's jaw worked, his fingers flexing at his sides. "More scars than I care to count," he admitted finally. Cole let out a breath. "Yeah, that's what I thought." They stood there, the weight of too many years pressing down between them. Nathan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You know, I told myself if I ever saw you again I'd make you answer for it." Cole's lips quirked. "You gonna take a swing at me?" Nathan huffed out a breath. "Hell, maybe I should." A pause. Then, finally, something in Nathan's stance eased. He shook his head, muttering, "Damn fool!" Cole smirked. "Takes one to know one." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Nathan's expression turned more serious. "You settling here?" Cole hesitated. If Nathan had asked him that a few weeks ago, he would have scoffed at the idea. Cole Maddox didn't settle, didn't put down roots, but now? Now there was Lily. Now there was land that needed protecting. A town that was beginning to look less like a stop along the way and more like something permanent. Now, for the first time in years, he had a reason to stay. "Yeah," he said finally, "reckon I am." Nathan studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, guess that's something." Cole tipped his hat. "Guess it is." Nathan let out a breath, then took a step back. "I won't be sticking around, but I figured you ought to know. Some of the old boys, they still remember. They still blame you." Cole's jaw tightened. "They coming after me?" "Not yet. But if they do..." Nathan's eyes darkened. "They won't be looking for forgiveness." Cole nodded slowly. "I'll be ready." Nathan gave him one last look, then turned and walked into the night. Cole watched him go, the weight of the past still pressing on his shoulders, but lighter somehow. Maybe because for the first time in years he wasn't running from it. Maybe because for the first time he had something worth standing his ground for. By the time Cole made it back to the sheriff's office, the lantern light from inside was spilling onto the street, warm and inviting. Lily was sitting on the front steps, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, her eyes lifting as he approached. "You okay?" she asked softly. Cole exhaled, sinking down beside her. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I am." She studied him for a moment, then simply nodded, as if she understood more than he was saying. They sat there in silence, the night settling around them, the past lingering but no longer looming, and for the first time, Cole Maddox felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't standing alone. Lily wiped the sweat from her brow and leaned back on her heels, staring at the battered old chest in front of her. The wooden box was buried beneath a pile of forgotten supplies in the loft of her father's barn, hidden beneath layers of dust, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. She hadn't meant to stumble upon it, not really. She'd come back to the farm after the town meeting, restless and aching for something tangible, something that reminded her of why she was fighting so hard to keep this land. She'd wandered into the barn, letting her fingers trail over the rough wooden beams, the scent of dry hay and old leather thick in the air. And then she'd found the chest. Her heart pounded as she traced her fingertips over the lid, the edges worn soft by time. She knew this chest. It had belonged to her father. He had kept his important papers locked away in it, ledgers, contracts, deeds. She had never dared open it before. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the rusted latch. It took some effort to pry it open, but when the lid finally creaked upward, the breath whooshed from her lungs. Inside, beneath yellowed sheets of parchment and brittle leather, bound ledgers, was a bundle of documents tied together with twine. Lily reached for them carefully, her pulse quickening as she untied the knot and unfolded the first paper. She scanned the words, barely breathing as the meaning sank in. It was a deed, but not just any deed. It was the original claim to all of her father's land, not just the acreage the bank was trying to take, but a far greater expanse, stretching beyond what she had thought was hers. Her eyes flew to the next document, and then the next. Mineral rights, water rights, old contracts her father had signed years ago with men whose names she barely recognized, agreements that guaranteed access to valuable resources, agreements that had never been voided. Her land wasn't just a piece of dry soil struggling to survive. It was valuable, more valuable than she'd ever imagined. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tried to take it all in. Her father had protected this land, built it from nothing, fought to keep it thriving, and now she was the last line of defense. She clutched the papers to her chest, her fingers digging into the fragile pages. She had spent weeks, months, fighting to hold on to what little she thought she had left, and all this time she had been standing on something so much more. It was empowering. It was terrifying. As now she had more to lose than ever before. She closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing against the knot in her throat. Her father had kept this hidden. Had he known what would happen if certain men had learned the truth? Had he feared someone would try to take it away? And if so, who else knew? Lily opened her eyes, her jaw tightening. It didn't matter. She knew now, and she would fight with everything she had to make sure no one took it from her. The barn was quiet around her, the dust mote swirling in the golden afternoon light. She should have felt triumphant, and she did. But there was something else beneath it, something heavier. This land, this fight, was bigger than her. It always had been. Her father had built something out of nothing. He had worked his fingers to the bone to make sure she had something to stand on. And now she understood the weight of what he had left behind. She had spent so much time worrying about whether she was making the right choice, whether she was becoming someone she didn't recognize. But now she realized she wasn't losing herself. She was becoming the woman she was meant to be. She pressed her palm flat against the old wooden chest, grounding herself. This wasn't just about saving a farm. This was about protecting a legacy, her father's, hers, theirs. By the time Lily made it back to the house, the sky had begun to darken, streaked with hues of pink and violet. The papers were clutched tightly in her hands, her thoughts still racing. She would need to tell Cole. She hesitated at the thought. He had helped her so much already, more than she'd ever expected. But this was hers. A part of her wanted to hold it close for just a little longer, to keep it tucked away where no one else could take it from her. And yet, her feet slowed as she reached the porch, and she lifted her gaze toward the sheriff's office, where she knew he was likely brooding over something of his own. She wasn't the only one with a past weighing on her shoulders. She wasn't the only one who had spent years running from something. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one who needed to stop running. She took a deep breath and stepped inside the house, the papers still in her grasp, the decision made. Tomorrow she would tell him. Tomorrow they would figure out what came next. And for the first time in a long time, Lily Macready felt like she wasn't just fighting for something real, something lasting, something worth every ounce of fight she had left in her. The town hall had never held so many people. Lily stood near the front, the dim lantern light flickering across faces she had known since childhood, neighbors, ranchers, merchants. Some regarded her with curiosity, others with outright suspicion. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, but she kept her back straight, her chin lifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. Cole stood beside her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his presence a solid, steady force. His sharp blue eyes swept over the crowd, reading their moods, the way a lawman had to, measuring where the threats lay, where the support might waver. Lily took a breath. "I know a lot of you don't trust me," she started, her voice carrying over the low murmur of voices. "I know some of you think I've got no business fighting for this land, that I should have let it go when the bank came knocking." A few heads nodded in agreement. Good. Let them see she wasn't afraid to face the truth. "But I also know that every man and woman in this room understands what it means to fight for something," she continued. "I grew up here just like you. I know the way this land bends and breaks under drought, the way we survive by leaning on each other when times get hard. I know how many of you are still paying back debts to the very same banks that tried to take what was mine. And I know that if they succeed in pushing me out, they won't stop there." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Cole took a step forward then, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "Lily ain't wrong. This town's been on the edge of losing itself for years. Ranchers are fighting over land that ain't rightly theirs. The banks are holding your futures in their hands, deciding who gets to stay and who don't." He paused, letting his words settle. "That ain't how it should be." A man near the back scoffed. "And what do you suggest we do, Sheriff? Just roll over and pretend like the banks don't own half the town?" Lily's fingers curled into fists, but she kept her voice steady. "No. I'm suggesting we stand together." She lifted the bundle of documents she had found in her father's chest and held them high. "These papers prove my father's claim to the land. They prove that the banks didn't have the right to take it in the first place. And if my land was stolen through legal trickery, how many of you think the same hasn't happened to you?" A few murmurs turned into louder conversations, people looking at one another with uncertainty. She pressed forward. "I know some of you have been offered pieces of my land. Maybe you thought it was fair. Maybe you thought you were doing what was best for your families. I don't blame you for that, but I am telling you, if we don't stand together now, if we let these men divide us and sell our land out from under us, we all lose." The room fell silent. Cole stepped in again, his voice low but commanding. "We're here to ask for your support, not just for Lily, but for every family in this town who's ever lost something to greed." His gaze swept the crowd. "If we fight together, we stand a chance. If we let them turn us against each other, we lose everything." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, a voice rose from the front. "I lost my pasture to a bank auction last year," a grizzled rancher muttered, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Thought I had another season to pay it off, but they changed the terms without telling me." A woman nearby nodded. "Same thing happened to my brother." "Mine too," another man added, scowling. Lily's pulse quickened. This was what she had hoped for, the understanding that this wasn't just her battle, it was all of theirs. "We need to organize," she said. "We need to go through every deed, every contract, and find out just how much of this town has been stolen out from under us. If we can prove fraud, we can take this to the courts." More murmurs. Hesitation. Cole stepped closer to her, his voice steady and sure. "We ain't asking you to do anything illegal. We're asking you to fight for what's rightfully yours, to stand together instead of letting them pick us off one by one." Another long pause. Then the grizzled rancher who had spoken first stepped forward. "All right," he said, folding his arms. "I'll help." Another man followed, then another. One by one the townsfolk began to nod, their skepticism shifting into something stronger. Resolve. Lily felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected this moment to feel so big. Hadn't expected the town that had once dismissed her as nothing more than a desperate girl to listen. And yet, here they were, standing together, fighting together. For the first time since her father died, she didn't feel like she was fighting this battle alone. She turned to Cole, meeting his gaze. Something passed between them then. Something quiet and unspoken. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about building something real, something worth every damn fight ahead of them. The meeting ended late, the townsfolk dispersing into the cool night air, voices low but determined. Lily stood on the porch of the town hall watching them go, exhaustion tugging at her limbs but unable to shake the steady hum of hope building inside her. Bill came up beside her, silent for a long moment before he spoke. "You did good tonight." She let out a breath, staring up at the star-filled sky. "We did good." He didn't argue. Instead, he tipped his hat back, watching her in that quiet, unreadable way of his. "You ready for what comes next?" Lily turned to him, meeting his gaze head-on. For the first time, she admitted, "I think I am." And she meant it. Chapter 5. The Calm Before the Storm. The town was different now. There was an energy running beneath the surface, a sense of urgency and determination that hadn't been there before. After the meeting, people had started talking, comparing land deeds, questioning bank notices, piecing together the pattern of how the town had been slowly, methodically stripped of its rights. It wasn't just about Lily's land anymore. It was about all of them. But change, Lily had learned, always came at a cost. The first warning came through Caleb Grady, a wiry, sharp-eyed rancher who had ridden in from his homestead just before sundown. "They ain't taking this sitting down," he muttered as he leaned against the sheriff's desk, his hat dusted from a hard ride. His voice was low, urgent, carrying the weight of what he'd heard on the wind. "Word is, a few big men in Red Bluff ain't happy about what we're stirring up." Cole, arms crossed over his chest, remained still, his blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "What kind of men?" Caleb exhaled. "The kind with deep pockets and no patience for people who don't know their place. The kind who send messages in the form of broken bones." He looked pointedly at Lily, then back at Cole. "I'd be careful if I were you. They're saying you two are the ones causing all this trouble." Lily's stomach tightened. Cole's jaw flexed. "Let them say what they want." Caleb gave a humorless chuckle. "That's the problem, Maddox. They ain't just talking." He hesitated. "I heard the name. Franklin Tate." Cole went still. Lily saw the change in his face, a flicker of something dark, something she didn't quite understand yet. "Who's Franklin Tate?" she asked. Caleb blew out a sharp breath. "He runs things out in Red Bluff, land deals, bank loans, most of the money that comes through these parts, and when he don't like the way things are going, people have a way of disappearing." Lily's throat went dry. Cole was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Appreciate the warning." Caleb tipped his hat and turned to leave, but before he stepped out he paused, glancing over his shoulder at Lily. "You're fighting the right fight, Miss McCready, but make sure you got the right people at your back." Then he was gone. The door swung shut behind him, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Lily turned to Cole. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. Cole ran a hand over his jaw, his expression unreadable. "A man who don't take kindly to losing." Her chest tightened. "You've dealt with him before." His jaw worked for a moment before he said, "Yeah. And if Tate's got his eyes on us, it means he's already got a plan." Lily swallowed against the fear rising in her chest. She'd always known this fight wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to feel so dangerous. Cole turned to her then, his gaze steady. "We're gonna have to be ready." Lily nodded, her fingers curling into fists. "Then we will be." Later that evening, as the town settled into uneasy quiet, Lily found herself outside the sheriff's office, staring at the darkened sky. The stars stretched endless above her, blinking down like silent witnesses to everything that was unfolding. She heard the door open behind her, the slow, measured sound of boots against the wooden steps. Cole came to stand beside her, silent for a long moment. "You should get some sleep," he murmured. She let out a soft breath. "So should you." He exhaled, shifting slightly so that their shoulders almost touched. Almost. "They're scared," she said quietly. "The town?" "Yeah." She hesitated. "You are too." Cole didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I'd be a fool if I wasn't." She turned to him, searching his face in the dim lantern light. "What are you afraid of?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher than before. "Losing this?" Her breath caught. "The fight?" "No." He shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "You." The words settled deep in her chest, warm and terrifying all at once. Lily swallowed hard, her pulse pounding. "You're not going to lose me, Cole?" His jaw tightened. "Tate ain't like the men we ran into before. He don't fight fair and he don't back down. If he wants this land, he'll come for it. He'll come for you." She reached for his hand before she could think better of it, her fingers curling around his. "Then let him come." Cole's breath hitched just slightly. For a moment neither of them moved. Then slowly he turned his palm to press against hers, his fingers warm and solid, grounding her. "We'll get through this," she murmured. His thumb brushed over the back of her hand, rough against her skin. "Yeah," he said softly, "we will." The promise hung between them, unspoken but understood, a quiet vow of protection, of trust, of something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. The next morning the town was buzzing, men and women gathered in small clusters, talking in low voices. The blacksmith sharpened tools with more urgency. The general store stocked supplies faster than usual. Even the saloon, normally a place of idle gossip and whiskey, had taken on a new energy, one of quiet, simmering resolve. They were preparing for war. And as Lily and Cole walked through the streets side by side, their hands still tingling from the night before, they knew, whatever happened next, they were in it together. The night was thick with tension, the air charged with anticipation. Every able-bodied man and woman in town had gathered, armed with whatever they could find, rifles, pistols, pitchforks, even rusted farm tools. The streets of Red Bluff had become a battleground, the dusty ground packed with boot prints, the scent of oil and gunpowder hanging heavy. Lily stood near the sheriff's office, her breath steady despite the pounding of her heart. Beside her, Cole checked his revolver, his expression unreadable, his movements precise. "They'll come at dawn," he murmured. "Tate don't do subtle. He'll want to make a show of it." Lily swallowed. "And we're ready?" Cole turned to her then, his blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Yeah, we're ready." And they had to be, because Franklin Tate was bringing war to their doorstep. The first shot rang out just as the sun crested the horizon, a warning, a declaration. Then the roar of hooves thundered across the valley. Lily's breath caught as she saw them. Tate's men, a dozen riders cutting through the morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Dust swirled in their wake, the ground trembling beneath the weight of their approach. Then chaos. Gunfire erupted, sharp and deafening, the acrid scent of burning powder filling the air. Cole was already moving, his revolver raised, barking orders to the townspeople as he fired off rounds with deadly precision. Lily ducked behind the wagon they had overturned as cover, her heart hammering. Men shouted. Horses screamed. A bullet splintered the wood near her shoulder, sending shards flying. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus. "You can't freeze now." Across the street, she saw Tate's men closing in, pressing against the town's hastily built defences. They outnumbered them, but the townspeople had something stronger. Resolve. Caleb Grady took down one of Tate's men with a clean shot from his rifle. The blacksmith swung a heavy iron rod, knocking another man clean off his horse. A farmer, no older than 18, held his ground with a shotgun, shaking but steady. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighting. Lily's hands clenched around the pistol Cole had given her. She wasn't a fighter either, but she was done being a victim. She took a breath and fired. The duel. The tide shifted when Cole locked eyes with Franklin Tate. Tate sat atop his black stallion, dressed in a fine vest and leather gloves, as if this were a business transaction instead of a bloodbath. He smirked, twirling his revolver, casual as ever. "Well, well, Maddox," he called out over the gunfire. I was wondering when we'd get to this part." Cole stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust. "Didn't think you had the guts to show your face," Tate chuckled. "Now that hurts. We could have been friends, you and me." Cole's fingers flexed around his revolver. "Not in this lifetime." The street fell into a strange silence, the fighting slowing as both sides turned to watch. A duel, the old way of settling things. Cole stood still, his body loose, his stance easy. But Lily knew him now. She saw the coil of tension in his muscles, the way his fingers hovered just near his holster. Tate smirked, his hand twitching, Lily's breath caught. Tate moved. Cole was faster. One shot, clean, precise. Tate staggered back, his revolver slipping from his fingers, his vest darkening with blood. For a long moment he just stood there. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees. His mouth opened, as if he had something to say. But nothing came out. Then he fell face first into the dust. For a second, no one moved. Then Tate's men broke. Some ran, others dropped their weapons, and just like that the battle was over. Lily barely had time to process before she saw movement. One of Tate's men, hidden behind the saloon, his rifle raised, aimed at Cole. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She yanked her pistol up and fired. The shot rang out, sharp and final. The man crumpled. Cole turned, his eyes wide, searching for the threat. Then he saw her, saw the smoking gun in her hands, the way her chest rose and fell. His expression softened. She'd saved him. He opened his mouth, but she beat him to it. "You're welcome, Sheriff." His lips twitched. "Reckon I owe you one." The dust settled. The town stood still, battered but victorious. People emerged from cover, eyes wide, limbs shaking, and then, slowly, cheers erupted. They had won. Lily felt something warm spread through her chest, something fierce and proud. She turned to Cole, and he met her gaze with something deep, something unspoken but understood. This wasn't just about winning. This was about building something new. Together, the dust had not yet settled. The acrid scent of gunpowder clung to the morning air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and sweat. Lily stood frozen in place, her breath coming in sharp bursts, the pistol in her trembling hand still warm from the shot that had saved Cole's life. She barely registered the bodies scattered in the dirt, the wounded groaning, the townspeople still gripping their weapons as they watched Tate's remaining men scatter like rats in the face of a sinking ship. None of it mattered, not now. Not as she turned toward Cole, the man she had once only thought of as a necessity, a means to an end. And now? Now he was everything. Cole stood just a few paces away, dust and blood streaking his face, his revolver still loose in his grip. He was staring at her, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers in a way that made the entire world fade away. Lily swallowed hard, barely able to find her voice. "Are you hurt?" His jaw flexed, his throat working as he swallowed. Then he shook his head. "No, thanks to you." Relief slammed into her with the force of a runaway stallion, so strong her knees nearly buckled. He must have seen it, because in the next breath he was in front of her, taking the gun from her hands, cradling her fingers between his rough palms. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and steady, but there was something raw beneath it. She nodded, exhaling shakily. "I didn't think. I know." He lifted a hand, brushing his knuckles against her cheek, sweeping away the dirt smudged there. His touch was unbearably gentle, a stark contrast to the chaos still echoing around them. "Lily!" he swallowed, his voice rough, as if he was fighting against something too big to hold back. Her heart pounded. "God!" For a moment they just stood there, staring at each other as the town stirred behind them, voices rising in victorious relief. The first hints of healing beginning even before the dust had fully settled. But here, between them, the battle wasn't over. Not the fight for the town, not the fight for themselves. Cole exhaled, his hand sliding from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his thumb grazing her skin. "I almost lost you today." Lily's throat tightened. "No, I almost lost you." Something in his expression broke then, the walls he had spent years building cracking under the weight of what he felt for her. "I can't. I won't let that happen again." Lily's breath hitched, emotion surging in her chest. This wasn't just a moment of relief. This was real. This was them. A future she hadn't dared dream about. A love she hadn't even realized she was capable of. Her hand came up, gripping the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. "Then don't." His sharp inhale was the only warning she got before his lips crashed into hers. It wasn't soft, wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, hungry, raw. The kiss of a man who had faced death and realized there was only one thing in this world he was willing to live for. Her, Lily melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, the heat of him searing into her, branding her in a way that had nothing to do with marriage papers or deals. This was a choice, a vow deeper than any spoken words. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathless, shaking. "Marrying you was the best damn decision I ever made," he whispered. Lily let out a shaky laugh, her eyes stinging. "And here I thought I was the one making a deal." Cole grinned, but it was softened by something deeper. He ran his hand down her back, grounding them both. "We fight together," he murmured. Lily nodded, gripping his wrist. "Always." And with that she knew this was it, not just a battle won, but the start of something far greater than either of them had ever expected. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the town slowly began to pull itself together. The wounded were tended to, the dead laid to rest, and though the scars of battle were evident, the air buzzed with something new, hope. Lily and Cole stood side by side as the people of Red Bluff gathered around them, looking for leadership, for guidance. For them. And as Cole slid his hand into hers, his fingers warm and solid, Lily knew they weren't just fighting for the land anymore, they were fighting for a future. The morning sun bathed Red Bluff in golden light, painting long shadows across the land that had been hard fought for and won. The town still bore the scars of battle, the cracked wood of buildings, the bullet holes in storefronts, the churned-up dirt where bodies had fallen, but beneath the wreckage something new had taken root. Hope. Lily stood at the edge of her homestead, the familiar stretch of land rolling out before her. For the first time in a long time she wasn't looking at it through the lens of fear or desperation. It was hers. Truly, undeniably hers. The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest, but this time it wasn't a burden. It was a promise. Behind her, the townspeople moved with quiet determination, setting to work with whatever tools and hands they had to give. The barn roof was being patched, the fences mended. The fields turned over, ready to be planted anew. Men and women who had once stood in opposition to her now labored beside her, their hands dirty with the work of building something better. It felt right. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth and sun-warmed timber. Lily closed her eyes, letting it settle over her like a benediction. "Feels different now, don't it?" She turned at the sound of Cole's voice, watching as he approached. He carried a hammer slung at his side, his sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening along the tan skin of his forearms. He looked different too, more at ease, more settled, as if he had finally found something worth holding on to, as if she was something worth holding on to. "It does," she admitted. "For the first time I'm not afraid of losing it." Cole nodded, glancing out at the land. "That's because you won." Lily let out a soft laugh. "Did I?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Yeah, darling, you did." A warmth spread through her at the endearment, at the quiet certainty in his voice. She had spent so long fighting, against the bank, against doubt, against the ghosts of the past, that she hadn't let herself believe in the future. But now, standing here with him, she realized she could. They had made a future, and it was only just beginning. Down in the town, the sheriff's office had taken on a new kind of weight. Cole had never cared much for titles. He had spent most of his life drifting, never staying in one place long enough to be anything more than a man passing through. But today, as he watched the people of Red Bluff work together, ranchers and shopkeepers, farmers and blacksmiths, he saw what they needed: not just a lawman, a leader, and somehow, without realizing it, he had become one. Caleb Grady approached him, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never thought I'd see the day this town pulled together like this." Cole smirked. "Yeah, I'd say we had a little encouragement," Caleb chuckled, glancing toward Lily. "That woman of yours sure knows how to make folks listen." Cole followed his gaze, watching as Lily spoke with a group of women near the mercantile, her hands moving animatedly, her face alight with purpose. She had come here fighting for her family's land, and in the process she had given the town a reason to fight for themselves. "She's something else," Cole murmured. Caleb nodded. "And so are you, Sheriff. If you weren't before, you sure as hell are now." Cole glanced around, taking in the bustling movement of his town, the town he had protected, had bled for, the town he had chosen. He exhaled. "Reckon I'll have to live up to that, then." Caleb clapped him on the back. "Reckon you already have." As the day wore on, the work continued, laughter breaking through the tired, aching limbs of people who had fought too long and too hard to not celebrate the moment. Cole found Lily near the well, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. He approached slowly, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She looked up at him, her green eyes bright, despite the exhaustion. "We did it?" she murmured. He tilted his head. "You did it." She huffed out a soft breath, shaking her head. "Not alone." "No," he agreed, "not alone." A pause. Then, quietly, he asked, "So what now, Lily Macready?" She studied him for a long moment, then reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Now?" she echoed, a slow smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Now we build something worth keeping." Cole felt something settle inside him at those words, something that had been restless for far too long. He pulled her closer, brushing his lips lightly over her forehead. "Sounds like a damn fine plan to me." And as the town of Red Bluff rose from the dust, forging itself anew, Lily and Cole stood at its heart, two souls who had found their way to each other, bound not just by land or battle, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of love. A love that would last far beyond the dust and the gunfire. A love that had become their destiny. Chapter 6. The stars above, the love below. The night stretched wide above them, a canvas of endless stars scattered across the velvet black. The last remnants of the day's work had faded into quiet, the town settling into the kind of peace that had once seemed impossible. Lily sat on the worn wooden steps of her porch, the land rolling out before her, bathed in the silver glow of the moon. It was different now. Still vast, still untamed, but no longer a battleground. No longer something she had to fight just to keep. It was home. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of fresh-turned soil and wild sage, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The rhythmic creak of boots on wood told her he was coming before she saw him. "Call?" He stepped up beside her, then wordlessly sank down onto the step, his broad frame easing into the space next to hers like it had always belonged there. He rested his elbows on his knees, hands loose between them, his sharp blue gaze fixed on the horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Lily murmured, "It doesn't feel real." Cole tilted his head toward her. "What doesn't?" She gestured at the land, the town, the life they had built from dust and fire. "This, all of it, feels like I spent so long fighting that I don't know what to do with the quiet." Cole's lips quirked, the hint of a smile playing there. "Ain't nothing wrong with quiet," she exhaled softly, leaning back against the porch post. "Maybe not, but it's new. Feels like I should still be looking over my shoulder." He studied her for a moment, then reached over, taking one of her hands in his. His grip was warm, steady, the same way he had been since the moment he'd stepped into her fight. "You ain't alone in this anymore, Lily," he said, his voice deep, sure. "You never have to be again." Her throat tightened, something raw and achingly sweet settling inside her chest. "I don't know if I know how to not be alone." He squeezed her hand. "Then I'll teach you." A small, wry laugh escaped her. "That right." Cole turned his body slightly, facing her fully now, his free hand lifting to brush a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Yeah, that's right." She met his gaze, and what she saw there, patience, understanding, something deeper that neither of them had dared name for so long, tipped something loose inside her. She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way." His brow furrowed. "What way?" Lily swallowed, her fingers tightening around his. "Safe." Cole went still. Then with quiet certainty he murmured, "You are safe." A tear slipped free before she could stop it. She let out a soft, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Damn you, Cole Maddox!" His lips twitched. "What did I do now? You mean it?" He didn't blink. "Yeah, I do. And somehow that, more than any contract, more than any legal battle, more than any victory, felt like the most important promise she had ever been given." She took a shaky breath. "You ever think about what comes next?" Cole exhaled, glancing back out at the horizon. "Used to be. I didn't let myself." Lily studied him. "And now?" His eyes found hers again, something quiet and unshakable settling there. "Now I reckon I can't picture a future that don't have you in it." The air between them shifted, stretched, settled, and for the first time Lily wasn't afraid of it. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, her eyes fluttering closed. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted in a whisper. Cole's hands cradled her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We'll figure it out together." She let out a breath, something light and free filling the space where doubt used to live. Then, softly, she murmured, "I love you." Cole stilled. Then, slowly, the corners of his lips curved, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. She smiled, something deep and right settling into her bones. "Then I guess we're stuck with each other." Cole chuckled, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. "Reckon we are, darlin'." And for the first time in forever, Lily let herself believe it. The weeks passed, and the town of Red Bluff stood stronger than ever. Fences mended, shops reopened, crops planted. It wasn't just a town anymore, it was a home. And at the center of it all was the homestead that had started everything. Lily's land, their land. It stood as a testament to what they had fought for, a promise that no matter how hard the storms came, they would stand. On the final evening before the harvest, Lily and Cole stood at the highest ridge, looking out over the land as the sun dipped low, turning the fields gold. She leaned into his side, his arm wrapping around her waist. "Think we did all right?" Cole smirked. "Better than all right." She tilted her head up at him. "So what now, Sheriff?" He looked down at her, his blue eyes full of something fierce and unwavering. "Now, we build a life." Lily smiled, tucking herself closer against him. And as the land stretched out before them, endless and full of possibility, she knew the future was theirs together.